The Andes rise in quiet, jagged lines across the southern continent, their peaks often hidden in shifting clouds. Snow covers much of the range at high elevations, settling into drifts that stretch across narrow valleys and plateaus. In the winter months, the air is thin and cold, carrying a clarity that sharpens the outlines of ridges and cliffs. Glaciers wind down from higher slopes, their surfaces cracked and ridged, reflecting light in muted shades of white and gray. Streams of meltwater thread through ice, forming small, partially frozen rivulets that descend into the valleys below. In this region, settlements are sparse. Roads that appear on maps often end abruptly, giving way to steep terrain and crevasses. Villages lie far apart, connected only by winding routes over snow-laden passes. The landscape is open yet confining, a series of ridges and depressions that can mislead even those familiar with the mountains. Wind moves unimpeded, carrying snow in fine drifts across the slopes, sometimes creating hidden cornices. At lower elevations, scrub and sparse vegetation can be found in sheltered areas, but higher up, the mountains are almost entirely rock, ice, and snow. Temperatures fluctuate sharply between day and night, and weather can change without warning. Clouds may rise quickly, obscuring visibility, and storms can sweep down from higher elevations, covering the mountains in white within hours. For anyone traveling this region, the scale of the mountains is imposing but calm. There is no immediate sense of danger, only the quiet immensity of rock and ice. Time moves slowly here, measured by the movement of snow across the ridges and the flow of water through frozen channels. The environment is isolated, vast, and indifferent, setting the stage for events that will test human endurance. The 5 men who would survive the crash were part of a larger group traveling from Montevideo, Uruguay, to Santiago, Chile, in October 1972. All were young adults, ranging from 22 to 30 years old, and each came from families in the city or rural areas. Some were students, others were members of rugby teams, and several had experience with physical activity and teamwork, though none were formally trained in high-altitude survival. Their backgrounds offered general fitness and stamina but little preparation for prolonged exposure to snow, ice, and sub-zero temperatures. They boarded the Fairchild FH-227, a medium-sized aircraft, along with friends, teammates, and family members. The journey was routine, planned to cross the southern Andes, a familiar air route for commercial and military flights connecting Uruguay and Chile. The men were accustomed to long-distance travel by air, aware of the mountain's presence but not of the full scale of their isolation at higher elevations. Maps and standard flight protocols offered a sense of security, reinforced by the assumption that weather conditions would remain predictable. Individually, each man carried the habits and resilience common to their upbringing. Those involved in rugby were accustomed to teamwork and enduring physical strain, while others had experience with outdoor activities such as hiking or skiing, though generally at lower elevations. None had faced sustained exposure to the extreme cold or the combination of high altitude, thin air, and treacherous terrain that defined the southern Andes. The group's motivation for the trip was straightforward: to reach the other side of the mountains and participate in scheduled events, family visits, or sporting commitments. There was no anticipation of risk beyond ordinary travel considerations. The Andes, while known for their height and sudden weather shifts, were perceived largely through reports, maps, and briefings. Immediate danger was not part of daily expectation. Even in the hours before departure, the men moved with routine efficiency. They packed personal items, ensured their identification and documents were in order, and exchanged brief words with companions. Equipment for personal warmth consisted of standard jackets and clothing suitable for mild winter conditions at mid-altitude. No specialized survival gear was carried, and no provisions anticipated a situation beyond the plane's capabilities. As the aircraft prepared for takeoff, the mountains remained in the distance, their white peaks gleaming under the morning sun. Clouds hung intermittently along the ridges, and wind currents swept across the lower slopes. From the perspective of the passengers, the environment was visible but not imposing. The Andes presented an image of vastness and quiet permanence. There were no indicators of the events that would unfold within the next hours, no hint of the isolation, snow, and ice that would dominate the men's immediate future. The combination of youth, physical fitness, and group cohesion would become critical. Each man's background offered limited advantages, mostly related to endurance, teamwork, and the ability to tolerate discomfort. These qualities, however, were insufficient for the environmental extremity that awaited. In retrospect, The pre-flight routine underscored the contrast between ordinary expectations of travel and the extraordinary demands of survival in the high Andes. The flight entered the southern Andes mid-morning, with the peaks rising steadily through scattered clouds. The aircraft ascended toward a pass between two mountain ranges, following the planned route from Montevideo to Santiago. Visibility was variable. Thin cloud layers occasionally revealed sheer cliffs, snow-covered ridges, and glaciers descending from the higher peaks. Winds were moderate, though gusts shifted with the mountain topography, creating localized turbulence. Approximately 40 minutes into the crossing, the plane began its descent toward the anticipated mountain pass. Navigation instruments indicated a standard trajectory, but a combination of cloud cover, snow reflection, and misread altimeter data created a discrepancy in altitude awareness. The plane approached a ridge that rose sharply from the valley floor. Snow and ice on the surface reflected sunlight, obscuring the precise contour of the terrain. The aircraft's fuselage struck the mountain slope at an estimated 3,600 meters, 11,800 feet. The initial collision severed part of the wing and compromised the landing gear, causing the plane to skid along the snow and ice. The momentum carried it partially over the edge of a glacial depression, where it came to rest across uneven snow and rock, embedded into a small natural depression on the mountainside. 5 men survived the initial impact. Injuries included fractures, lacerations, and varying levels of bruising. The fuselage had split, and sections of the cabin were crushed under impact. Snow surrounded the wreckage, and wind carried intermittent drifting across the slope, covering debris in thin layers of white. Temperatures at that altitude were below freezing, and the thin air made movement and respiration more difficult. From the survivors' perspective, the surrounding landscape was stark and uniform. Snowfields extended in several directions, interrupted only by rock outcroppings and glacial crevasses. The mountains rose on all sides, and the nearest signs of human habitation were distant by several kilometers, inaccessible along steep slopes. Communication devices were damaged in the crash, and no immediate means of contacting external assistance remained. Isolation was complete. The men faced a landscape of snow, ice, and rock, exposed to cold and wind. The plane wreckage offered partial shelter, but the environment was unyielding. The moment marked the point of no return. Immediate survival required assessment of injuries, available materials, and the relentless cold that dominated the Andes at this altitude. The wreckage of the aircraft became the immediate center of survival. Sections of the fuselage were partially intact, providing some protection from wind and snow. Metal walls, while warped and cold, blocked the direct force of gusts, and remnants of seats and luggage created partitions that could be used to insulate sleeping areas. The survivors quickly assessed which parts of the cabin were structurally sound and which areas were too exposed or prone to collapse. Snow accumulation was continuous, driven by light winds that shifted direction along the mountainside. Drifts formed around the fuselage, partially burying debris and creating natural barriers. Within these small walls of snow, pockets of air offered slightly warmer conditions. The men used seat cushions, pieces of luggage, and blankets from the wreck to layer insulation against the cold metal surfaces. Small fires were impossible due to the lack of fuel and the risk of melting structural support, so layering became the primary method of retaining body heat. Task division emerged as a practical necessity. One man maintained the shelter, clearing snow drifts and reinforcing insulation each morning. Another scouted nearby terrain for potential sources of water, testing snow and ice for consumption after minimal melting. 2 others monitored the wreckage for usable items, including food packages, containers, and any remaining clothing or bedding. The 5th remained mobile, observing wind patterns, sun angles, and snow stability, identifying areas of relative safety and potential risk from avalanches or slides. Water became a primary concern. Snow was abundant, but consumption required melting or gradual absorption to prevent lowering body temperature. Men used metal containers salvaged from the wreckage to hold snow, allowing limited amounts to melt during daylight hours, their hands insulated by layers of cloth. Small adjustments to positioning inside the shelter reduced wind exposure, conserving heat during periods of rest. Daily routines were established to impose structure and maintain physical activity. Mornings involved checking shelter integrity, clearing snow from entrances, and inspecting the surrounding slopes for changes in snow accumulation or crevasse development. Midday was dedicated to melting snow and rationing available food. Evenings focused on reorganizing insulation layers, repairing damaged materials, and arranging sleeping positions to minimize heat loss. Movement was deliberate and limited to conserve energy, but regular activity was necessary to maintain circulation and prevent stiffness. Observing the environment provided both practical and psychological benefits. The survivors noted changes in cloud cover, temperature, and wind direction, allowing minor adjustments in shelter positioning. Ice formations were examined to assess stability, and surrounding slopes were scanned for potential avalanche risk. These observations informed decisions about when to venture outside for essential tasks and when to remain within the relative safety of the fuselage. Group dynamics were steady, guided by necessity rather than discussion. Decisions were functional and based on observable conditions. There was no reliance on expectation of external rescue at this stage. Instead, priority was assigned to securing shelter, ensuring hydration, and conserving energy. Materials from luggage and cabin fixtures were rearranged multiple times to improve insulation and comfort. Even small improvements, such as stacking seat cushions against a windward wall or covering metal floors with layers of cloth, contributed to a measurable reduction in heat loss. Through methodical observation and routine, the men adapted to the extreme altitude and cold. They measured time in cycles of shelter maintenance, snow collection, and careful monitoring of the wreckage. Exposure to wind and drifting snow remained constant, but the shelter offered protection sufficient to prevent immediate hypothermia. The structure of the fuselage became a central tool in survival, a stable environment within an otherwise unyielding landscape. This phase established the foundation for extended survival. By combining environmental observation, structured daily routines, and utilization of available materials, the men created conditions that allowed them to endure days of extreme cold and isolation. While injuries and exhaustion remained, the systematic approach to shelter and routine maximized the likelihood of continuing survival. Once shelter and basic routines were established, attention turned to food. The aircraft carried only the supplies intended for a short flight: snacks, canned items, and some personal provisions, but these were limited. Initial rationing was strict, with each man receiving calculated portions to extend the available supply. Paper wrappers, plastic containers, and packaging were conserved as well, as they could be reused to store remnants and reduce waste. The surrounding environment offered few natural sources of sustenance. The high Andes at over 3,600 meters presented snow, ice, rock, and occasional patches of hardy alpine vegetation. There were no animals large enough to hunt reliably in the immediate area, and the snow-covered landscape limited movement and visibility. Initial food consumption relied entirely on salvaged packages from the wreckage, with careful measurement to ensure even distribution. After several days, the scarcity of supplies prompted assessment of additional resources. Any small items left in the cabin, including chocolate, candy, and bits of dried fruit, were inventoried and incorporated into the ration. The survivors adapted portions to individual energy requirements, taking into account activity levels, injuries, and exposure to cold. Even minor adjustments to calorie intake were significant, as energy conservation became as important as nourishment itself. Water management continued alongside food. Melting snow provided hydration, but excessive consumption risked lowering core body temperature. The men monitored portions and used containers salvaged from luggage and the cabin. Ice from nearby drifts was sometimes scraped and used directly in small amounts, providing minimal hydration while avoiding prolonged exposure to cold surfaces. Movement outside the fuselage was deliberate. Trips to nearby slopes were limited and planned to minimize exertion while maximizing potential gains. Occasional small birds or scavenging opportunities were noted, though most attempts yielded no edible results. Environmental assessment remained constant, with particular attention to unstable snow, hidden crevasses, and wind conditions. Each excursion was brief, and procedures were repeated consistently to prevent accidents. Daily routine reinforced both physical and mental endurance. Mornings were spent melting snow and adjusting the shelter. Midday was devoted to rationing food and monitoring injuries, while afternoons involved observation of environmental conditions and inspection of nearby terrain for any changes that could provide resources or indicate danger. Evening periods were reserved for maintaining insulation, arranging bedding, and organizing salvageable materials from the wreckage. This routine structured time and ensured tasks were addressed efficiently. Maintaining body heat and energy required balancing activity and rest. Physical movement generated warmth but consumed calories quickly, while extended inactivity risked hypothermia and loss of circulation. Tasks were rotated among the 5 men to distribute energy expenditure evenly. Use of clothing layers, blankets, and insulated seating surfaces within the fuselage reduced heat loss during rest periods. Adaptation to the environment also included careful monitoring of injuries and health. Frostbite, bruising, and minor lacerations were managed by covering exposed skin and limiting movement in the cold. Conserved clothing and fabric materials were used to protect vulnerable areas. Observation of each other's condition allowed the men to adjust activity and rationing to maintain the group's overall functionality. Through these strategies, the men sustained themselves for extended periods despite the extreme cold, limited food, and isolation. Survival depended not on improvisation but on disciplined, consistent procedures. The combination of ration provisions, cautious water consumption, deliberate movement, and routine monitoring of environmental hazards created a sustainable, if minimal, system of support. The structured approach to procuring and managing food and energy became central to enduring the high-altitude Andes landscape, where exposure and scarcity were constant. As days progressed, the effects of the high-altitude environment and limited nutrition became increasingly apparent. Temperatures remained below freezing at night, with daytime highs rarely exceeding the low single-digit Celsius. Constant wind carried snow across the fuselage, infiltrating the shelter despite insulation efforts. The men experienced gradual fatigue, with injuries sustained in the crash limiting mobility and increasing energy expenditure for simple tasks. Frostbite developed in fingers and toes, primarily in those who had sustained minor cuts or abrasions in the initial impact. Cold exposure combined with limited calorie intake slowed circulation, making even routine movement difficult. Muscles ached from the combination of altitude, inactivity, and the strain of maintaining shelter and melting snow. Bruises and lacerations remained unhealed, as the cold and limited supplies prevented proper treatment. Psychological strain became significant. Time lost normal markers, and days were measured only by routine tasks: snow melting, rationing food, monitoring wind, and reinforcing the fuselage. The monotony of white slopes and distant peaks contributed to mental fatigue. The men maintained functional focus through strict task allocation, but the environment imposed persistent cognitive and emotional pressure. Attempts to descend or signal for help were limited by terrain and physical condition. Nearby slopes were steep, unstable, and snow-covered, increasing the risk of falls or avalanches. Crevasses and hidden ice presented hazards, restricting mobility to a narrow area around the fuselage. Each attempt to move further required careful observation of snow stability and wind conditions, and even minor miscalculations could result in injury or loss. Rationed food continued to diminish, and the caloric deficit became more pronounced. Minimal activity was preserved for essential survival tasks, yet energy consumption remained high due to cold exposure and altitude. Snow melting required fuel in the form of body heat, and prolonged activity risked exhaustion. Environmental hazards remained constant. Snowstorms occasionally reduced visibility to a few meters. Wind gusts carried fine ice particles that penetrated insulation layers. Nights were particularly severe, with temperatures dropping well below freezing and wind creating persistent drift around the shelter. The combination of physical injuries, caloric deficiency, and environmental exposure led to gradual weakening. Men moved more slowly, performed tasks with greater effort, and required longer periods of rest. Despite these challenges, strict adherence to routine and observation of the environment allowed the group to maintain minimal function. Each day involved careful management of energy, water, and shelter integrity. This period marked the most severe test of endurance. The Andes imposed consistent physical and psychological pressure, and survival depended on measured adaptation to limitations. The men confronted ongoing deterioration in health and strength, yet methodical procedures and disciplined observation ensured continued survival. After 72 days in the high Andes, the survivors were located by search teams that had resumed efforts following information obtained from 2 men who had traveled on foot to find help. The search extended across snowfields, glaciers, and ridges, with aircraft and ground teams coordinating based on last known coordinates and estimated drift from wind and terrain. Visibility remained challenging, with intermittent clouds and snow flurries complicating observation from the air. Upon arrival, rescuers identified the fuselage partially buried in snow, with tracks leading toward nearby slopes. The wreckage's metallic surfaces reflected sunlight, providing a visual marker amid the predominantly white landscape. The survivors were in weakened condition, displaying signs of frostbite, malnutrition, and physical exhaustion, yet they were able to indicate the presence of others within the fuselage. Extraction required careful movement due to unstable snow and ice around the site. Helicopters lowered lines to bring the men from the high-altitude plateau to areas where ground vehicles could transport them to medical facilities. Snow-covered slopes and nearby crevasses dictated precise coordination. Rescuers monitored wind and temperature, minimizing exposure time during extraction. Medical teams immediately assessed injuries and administered treatment for hypothermia, dehydration, frostbite, and trauma from the crash. Survivors were transported to hospitals at lower elevations for continued care. The surrounding mountains remained unchanged. Snow, ice, and rock persisted, offering no indication of the prolonged period the men had endured. The rescue concluded without ceremony. Observers documented the conditions of the wreckage, the physical state of the men, and the environmental challenges. Survival was noted as a product of disciplined adaptation to extreme altitude, cold, and isolation, rather than any fortuitous intervention. The Andes remained vast and indifferent, a landscape that had imposed the test and allowed the endurance of human effort to persist. Following rescue, the 5 men underwent medical treatment for injuries sustained during the crash and for conditions resulting from prolonged exposure to cold and high altitude. Frostbite required attention, with minor tissue loss in some cases, while malnutrition and dehydration were addressed through regulated intake and monitoring. Bruises, fractures, and other trauma from the initial impact were treated methodically, prioritizing functionality and mobility. Recovery extended over several weeks, with the men gradually regaining strength under medical supervision. Physical rehabilitation focused on regaining coordination and endurance lost during 72 days of restricted movement. Nutritional rehabilitation was conducted in stages, allowing metabolism to adjust to consistent intake after prolonged rationing. Beyond the medical perspective, the incident became a point of study for aviation safety and high-altitude survival. Analysis of the flight path, navigation errors, and environmental conditions informed subsequent adjustments in flight procedures over the Andes. The survival of the 5 men demonstrated the importance of structured routines, environmental observation, and disciplined energy management in extreme conditions. In a broader context, the episode highlighted human capacity to endure isolation and environmental stress. The mountains remained unchanged, their peaks and glaciers indifferent to human presence. The Andes continued to present hazards of wind, snow, and altitude, yet also offered a framework in which systematic adaptation could sustain life. The men returned to their communities with ongoing observation of the physical and psychological effects of prolonged exposure and extreme conditions. Over time, the incident became a documented example of survival in high-altitude environments, providing practical data for both military and civilian applications. The story concludes in quiet observation. The Andes Mountains retain the traces of human endurance, the wreckage remains partially visible, and the landscape continues to demonstrate the scale, isolation, and environmental challenge faced by those 5 men. Survival, in this context, was a product of methodical adaptation, consistent procedure, and measured endurance rather than circumstance or luck.